the McLaughlin College. Welcome everyone to the McLaughlin College Lunchtime Talks. Before we start our lunchtime talks, we always do the land acknowledgement. This meeting is virtual, and because of that, we are not all actually gathered in the same space. York's land acknowledgement might not represent the territory that you are currently on. And I would ask, if that is the case, that you each take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory that you are on and its current treaty holders. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory. I'm hearing an echo, I'm sorry. Of many Indigenous nations, the area known as Tookarondo has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. We're very pleased today to welcome George Fallis, who is a university professor emeritus of economics and social science here at York University, as well as a fellow of McLaughlin College. He completed his BA in political science and economics at the University of Toronto and a doctorate in economics at Princeton University. And he has published widely on many topics. His most recent publication is on multiversities, ideas and democracy with U of T Press in 2007. And he contributes on a regular basis opinion pieces in newspapers. And I had the pleasure of reading this afternoon his more recent publication in the Financial Post, scoring Canada's COVID fight over its first 3 months of 6. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome George Fallis, who will be addressing democratic politics, ethics, and expertise reflections on Canada's fight against COVID-19.
Well, thank you, James. Am I coming through here?
Yes, you are, George.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm always delighted to get the invitation because I find preparing and getting ready and thinking really very terrific fun, and doing it at McLaughlin is terrific fun. Unfortunately, we're not together at McLaughlin, and this is my first ever Zoom talk, so please bear with me, and I hope it has some sort of flow and I can use the technology appropriately. The lives of everyone in Canada have been disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic and by the government lockdown decisions to slow down the spread of the virus. Some people got seriously ill, many died, some lost their jobs. Schools were closed, many had to work from home using Zoom and other new communications technologies. Everyone from time to time had to live under stay-at-home orders, unable to visit family and friends. Many academics reoriented their research because of the pandemic and its disruptions and devoted more effort to contribute to public debate. I'm no exception. What they have worked on, of course, depends on their field and their orientation in that field. So, oopsie. I've chosen to talk on democratic politics, practical ethics, and expertise. Reflections on Canada's fight against COVID-19. This talk is a case study, really, about government decisions in a democracy. So I start from this idea of democracy, thinking about the fundamental idea there that people should be able to govern themselves and indeed have the knowledge or the ability to think through the knowledge to govern themselves. I started off on this partly because in the newspaper, I kept seeing so often discussions about the issues led by a headline, "Experts Say." And there was a lot also of discussion about, as we've gone through this fight against COVID-19, we've had too much politics and not enough science. I've used the word expert or expertise very broadly. Broadly speaking, it's specialized knowledge that the ordinary citizen or the politician does not have. But when I talk about expertise, I'm going to be focusing here particularly on scientific expertise, ranging all the way from basic science to clinical and infectious disease science and epidemiological modeling and so on. The role that they've played in this issue of government decision-making in a democracy. The more careful among you will note that I've changed the title slightly from the original announcement. Before I said it was Democratic Politics, Ethics, and Expertise, and I changed it to Practical Ethics and Expertise. In part, this is a nod to the York Collegium on Practical Ethics, a co-sponsor of this series, but also it was the result of my doing some further reading and thinking about how you think about, as an economist, I normally would have used the word values, but then I started to think about ethics and moral reasoning. And I was led to do some reading about practical ethics, and in particular, an article about practical ethics at Harvard that I'll turn to through this talk. But that led me to think that practical ethics is probably a good term for framing a lot of what I want to do here. So, what is my field and orientation that I bring to this looking at government decision-making in the context of COVID-19? I'm an economist with an interest in public policy, and I'm concerned with you often with the effects of government policy on the distribution of income. Sometimes this field or orientation is called political economy. And indeed, I did my bachelor's degree in the Department of Political Economy at U of T, a degree in political science and economics. I did my PhD in straight ahead neoclassical economics. But often when I introduce myself, and certainly to my students, I say, I think of myself as someone in the Oxford tradition of PP and E, of philosophy, politics, and economics. And within the idea here is that you need all three to study public policy. And within philosophy, there's a particular focus on political and moral philosophy. So I brought this PP&E orientation to my study of COVID-19 and government. I title it Reflections because I've not done a formal academic paper on it, so I thought it better to call it Reflections than to. So let's now just provide a quick outline for what I want to do. First, I want to look at this disease, COVID-19, how it spread across the country, its patterns, and focus particularly on government decisions regarding how to slow the spread of the virus, particularly the restrictive or lockdown decisions. Immediately on thinking about having to make those decisions, we see there's a big trade-off between health or even lives and the economy or jobs. So that led me to thinking about how do we in government decision-making confront these trade-offs? How do we make a decision? Well, inevitably to make such decisions requires values or ethics. So I'm going to look at the role of values and ethics in these government decisions as we went through the fight against COVID-19. Having done that, as I said, I thought the overarching term practical ethics for what I was doing was important. So I'm going to look at that article, that very short article about ethics at Harvard, and talk about practical ethics. So then what I next do is I say to myself, well, here we've got government decisions, and we're thinking about the role of expertise, and we're thinking about the role of values. Let's go in some sense to theory and ask ourselves, what does democratic theory tell us about these issues? And in the first instance, I'm going to look particularly at classical thought, Greek and Roman thought about democracy and its alternatives. And we'll see that front and center was the idea of values and expertise. Then that is a direct democracy world. So in section 4, I'm going to say, well, suppose we wanted to think about this question of democratic decision-making in a modern Canadian representative democracy. And so I'll think about that structure. And then I'll conclude by looking at how we might think of this theory in light of what we saw in section 1. And then finally, I'll touch on briefly 2 questions which have always been in the back of my mind as I did this work. The first is, why didn't we do better in our fight against COVID-19? In particular, why weren't we able to do a better job against the second wave? And a sort of meta question that lies in the background for me is, are there any lessons from what we've observed in the fight against COVID-19 for going forward the fight against climate change? So I'll touch briefly on those, but those were larger questions which I always had in the back of my mind as I did this kind of thinking. So let's start then by looking at COVID-19 and its spread across Canada. This is the graph you've probably seen dozens of times. This is the weekly weighted average of new cases in Canada. So what we see is in March of 2020, the first cases came, well, in early March of 2020. They rose quite quickly. Then they receded, and so by early June, they'd receded significantly, and we had what we call the first wave of COVID-19. Then we had a long, relatively flat period from about mid-June till late August. That summer we look back on so fondly from today. Then somewhere in early September, the cases started to go up, and they went up extremely strongly, continuously, and they reached a peak much higher than the first wave. And even though there's some data problems because we didn't have as widespread testing during the first wave, so the first wave is probably bigger than it looks, than what is portrayed here. Nonetheless, I think it's pretty clear that the second wave was much bigger than the first. And the other striking thing about the second wave was it took us much longer to come to terms with it. It's almost 6 months to address the second wave, whereas we addressed the first wave in about 3 months. And then now there we are in mid-March. We haven't brought the second wave all the way down. We're kind of leveling around 2,800, and we're clicking up and down. So that's the broad pattern of the disease in Canada. Then if we look at that and superimpose the government restrictions, if you let me just back up a bit. So when this graph should really begin not March 1st, 2020, but really January 1st, 2020. The beginning of January in 2020, we first heard about a strange flu-like disease emerging in China, in Wuhan. Very quickly, it began to spread. Canada had its first case in January. By February, we were hearing horror stories out of northern Italy, huge lockdowns, hospital systems totally overwhelmed. From that 1st of January to mid-February, we had an extraordinary outpouring of basic science. First, the virus was identified. By June the 30th, the genome had been sequenced and circulated on the internet. And by mid-February, we had pretty reliable tests. So we couldn't have drawn this curve without that basic science being able to test people to see whether they had COVID-19. Somewhere in March, maybe February, science began to help us understand this virus. First of all, it was highly infectious. It was passed from person to person by still some ambiguity, either by droplets or by aerosols, much finer droplets, which can float on the air for a period of time. And therefore, it passed between people when they were close to one another. It passed between people in particular due to coughing, sneezing, shouting, singing, close proximity. It also could last for a time on surfaces, so that if you coughed on your hand and touched someone, or if someone had it on their hand and you touched their hand, it could pass. And it turned out, we were worried for quite a while, but it doesn't appear that on other hard surfaces it can last for a time, but not that long. The absolute key to the transmission was proximity of people. And in particular, proximity when you're talking or sneezing or coughing. So you had to keep people at least 6 feet apart from one another. And it was more likely to be transferred the closer you were, the longer the duration, and if you were indoors. So this science then got fed into government decision-making. And this was something I sort of having not ever worked in health policy, I found quite striking immediately that we actually have in our government structures a special structure set up to handle infectious disease, among other things. And that's our system of public health. We have chief medical officers of health, we have public health units, and they're responsible for thinking, preparing, offering advice on infectious disease. And indeed, they have the authority to implement quarantining restrictions. So we had this outpouring of scientific information into the system. And the system, the public health people said, in order to stop the spread of the virus, you have to impose severe restrictions on people's proximity. So that's what led to the restrictions. Well, I like to think of them as both on people, just as people, and also on businesses and other organizations. So on people, we had restrictions often called stay-at-home orders, saying you could only go outside for essential purposes, food, medical reasons, exercise, your job. Couldn't share households, couldn't socialize outside. Then restrictions on organizations. Some businesses, of course, had to remain open. So we had a whole sector of the economy, the essential businesses remaining open. A whole section of the economy couldn't open, but extraordinarily, again, because of another huge technological expertise background to this particular time of our lives, were able to switch to doing their activities online. If you told me that York University could switch its undergraduate curriculum online in the space of a month, if you told me that 2 years ago, I would have said that's absolutely impossible. Absolutely impossible. So we had restrictions on business, and then many businesses were closed. particularly those that involve close proximity indoors for a long period of time. So bars, restaurants, gyms, arts organizations, schools, and so on. So over this overlay of the COVID-19 pattern, we see tight restrictions to bring down phase one, the first wave, followed by a period of loose restrictions when those tight restrictions had stopped the spread and we had this calm period. Then the virus started to take off again, and we had very gentle reintroduction of restrictions as that virus began to spread and the cases went up and up and up. We were very slow to reintroduce restrictions. Then in the next, I call them rounds, in the next round, the next quarter, meeting from January to March, we reimposed very severe restrictions. The cases came down dramatically, and now we're in the business of gradually reopening them. And of course, we're left wondering still, the vaccinations are now arriving, they're being rolled out, but we haven't got the case counts down that far. There's worry about variants of concerns, new variants that are more infectious, and perhaps what lies ahead is a third wave. We don't know. Finally, I want to impose on this diagram, or superimpose on this diagram, what happened to the economy over this period. During the period when we imposed severe restrictions, basically the second quarter of 2020, from end of March till the end of June, as all those businesses closed and people struggled to figure out how to go online, GDP dropped precipitously. And unemployment soared. So tight restrictions gave us a collapse of GDP. In the third quarter, from the end of June till the beginning of October, when, although the restrictions were loose, the previous tight restrictions had stopped the spread, GDP surged back up again. So in the second quarter, GDP fell 11%, and in the third quarter, GDP went back up 10%. As we had loose restrictions and things went up, the cases spread, GDP slowed greatly, but still grew only slowly. And as we've imposed tight restrictions now in the first quarter of 2020, we don't have the GDP numbers yet. Unemployment's gone up again. We get that monthly. It's probable that we're going to have some decline in the first quarter of 2021. So finally, to superimpose on this is, of course, what lies behind or lagged from the cases is deaths. So in the first wave, we had about 8,500 deaths. We had low deaths in the middle period. And in the second wave, we've had 50% more deaths than the first wave. We've had nearly 1,600 deaths, and we don't even have till the end of the first quarter to look at there. So let me just stop the share there for a moment and say, as we look at that, there's been an unprecedented public policy challenge over this last 14 months. It's unquestionably the worst infectious disease outbreak since the Spanish flu. It's the first time government has ever imposed such radical restrictions on people's individual movements. In that second quarter of 2020, we had the sharpest economic decline we've ever recorded. And what I didn't mention, but also accompanying that enormous economic decline was enormous government fiscal support for businesses and people leading to soaring government deficits. And that fiscal support has continued through all the quarters, so government deficits are enormous. You might argue that perhaps this is a bad situation in which to study government decision-making. It's truly unique. But nonetheless, I think we can see here that there are some themes that are always there in government decision-making. How do we use expertise in government decision-making? In this case, we had enormous expertise brought to bear. We formed special science tables to bring experts from hospitals, from universities, into the decision-making through the public health system, into cabinet. And I think we can see here we're confronted with enormously complicated trade-offs to make that require ethics or value judgments to make. The broadest trade-off, of course, is between restrictions, which save lives, and jobs. The restrictions hurt jobs. It's a little more complicated than that, of course. The restrictions save lives, but they restrict people's liberty, and people feel liberty as a value. The restrictions cause mental health problems for many people. The restrictions close schools and have imposed significant problems for families and for young children. And of course, the burden of the health and the burden of the disruption is very unevenly shared. The greatest burden for the lives lost has fallen on the elderly. The greatest burden for the disruptions has fallen on low-wage workers, people who work in essential industries, people who live in high-density, more congregate settings, and in many instances, this conjunction of low-wage, congregate setting, essential work we find a lot of BIPOC, marginalized, racialized people suffering disproportionately from the burdens of the disruption. So, as we think about this dilemma of okay, I've got to just take us on here. I'll just skip those and say, as we think about the question of ethics and values in a democracy, in government decision-making, as I said, I don't know whether the York Collegium on Practical Ethics, when it was the York Center for Practical Ethics, was quite influenced by the Harvard Center. I'm not enough of a historian. I went on your website and didn't see a nice little essay on what is practical ethics. So I ended up on Harvard's website on this lovely essay from the founder of the Harvard Center on Practical Ethics, Dennis Thompson, a political scientist and political theorist. He said, and I found all of this very interesting. He said, they've tried to take an extremely interdisciplinary approach to thinking about ethics, and that it has very substantive, both scholarly and curricular implications. Both of these ideas I found quite interesting. The importance of practical ethics as a scholarly exercise and practical ethics in a curriculum. Practical ethics bridges theory and practice, and within the theory domain, moral and political philosophy are essential. And then this little essay talked about what I found, again, from my very limited background, quite interesting. He said that when we think about ethical issues or moral issues, we need moral reasoning. How do we think about the good? How do we decide about the trade-offs and so on? I was quite familiar with that. But he also said we need moral perception, the ability to recognize complex moral issues in their institutional and practical context. And then we also need moral character, the commitment to live a life according to ethical principles. he said the second aspect of practical ethics is the idea that when we talk about these things, institutional context matters. Is it at the societal level? Is it at the individual level? Or is it at, say, an institutional level? Is it at the level of a university or a hospital? In our case, it's at the level of government and government decision-making. And the third aspect of framing all this as practical ethics is that these questions are fundamentally political in nature. These ethical questions are fundamentally political. That is, that people reasonably disagree on many ethical issues. And so we have to think about not just what is the right decision, but who has the right to make the decision. And in order to resolve or think through or work on practical ethics, we need a process of deliberation. So I was in a So as I read that, as I say, I was struck by several things, particularly this idea of moral reasoning, moral perception, and moral character, the importance of recognizing the place of practical ethics in a curriculum, and that inherently when we think about practical ethics, it's a question in politics. It's not just what is the right decision, but who has the right to make the decision, and how do we deliberate about making such decisions. So now let's turn to thinking about theory and say to ourselves, how did in original classical thought we think about these questions? So in classical thought, particularly Greek and Roman, they identified 6 types of government. In the first column were sort of what were called good structures of government: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. And on the other column, degenerating or difficult or bad forms of government: tyranny, oligarchy, and autocracy. Another, the more common word for autocracy is mob rule. So if we look at the first column, basically it's a column about rule by whom. So in the first case, it's monarchy is the rule by one. In the second case, it's aristocracy, the rule by a few. And in the third case, it's democracy, it's ruled by all. So they thought very carefully about how we think about decision making. But interestingly, in classical thought, there was the recognition that an individual could think about the common good and could resolve the competing dilemmas about governing the whole. And so a monarch was the single person in charge, but they were capable of acting on behalf of the common good. It could degenerate into tyranny. Tyranny is the rule of the one, where they cease to think on behalf of the common good. Aristocracy is not the way we use it now. Very clearly, aristocracy was not hereditary, was not based on wealth or position. Where I guess most people are more familiar with it under the terminology of Plato's philosopher kings or guardians. In this form of government, society was divided up into the producers, the warriors who defended the society and supposed order, and the guardians or the philosopher kings. The guardians were a special type of person who both had superior knowledge about how to achieve things, in other words, had expertise, but also had knowledge and training and wisdom about ethical issues and was committed to acting on behalf of the common good. So that's why Plato recommended philosopher kings as a form of government, because they were both expert and ethical. And the classical thought such people could exist. That can degenerate and become an oligarchy. And then very interestingly, they identified the notion of if the aristocrats started to own land and the position of government by few became hereditary, it could degenerate into oligarchy. Then there was democracy, the rule by the many. And here the Greeks confronted the question of, well, if we have the rule by the many, how do we think about dealing with expertise? Because clearly the many don't have the expertise to make decisions. So this is where the Greeks placed great emphasis on what we might call a liberal education, an education for democracy, an education in what they called citizen wisdom, so that citizens would acquire the knowledge to be able to govern themselves, or to at least to understand and deliberate with the experts. And also democracy required a forum for discussion, a forum for deliberation. So in the classical thinking, we had very strong representation of this idea of expertise and ethics and how we resolve them. And these are a necessary part of thinking about the system of government we choose. I just put there at the end of that slide a representation of it. That's actually the Article 1 of the UN International Human Rights Declaration. This, to many people, is the sort of the foundation of democracy, but I think it's quite indicative of what we're talking about here. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience. In other words, people can think through the issues and have expertise, and they have conscience and they can think through the issues on ethical issues. So given that people are endowed with reason and conscience and we're all equal, people can govern themselves. Now let's turn to a quick look at how we might represent democracy, not in theory, but in a big country like Canada, where we've moved to representative democracy, and try to see how ethics, expertise, and people governing themselves begin to come into actual democracies. So of course, we start out with citizen voters who choose representatives, but always when we talk about a democracy, there's lying in the background this idea of, do we want our representative to be a trustee? In some sense, we've said, we're going to let you act on our behalf and think through the moral questions and make the choices, or do we want you to be our delegate? Are you merely carrying our thought into the forum? Then we have political parties that form platforms, have elections, we get a legislature, the majority party leader becomes the prime minister, chooses a cabinet, and then we have this formal structure of how expertise enters our decision-making. Cabinet ministers are heads of departments. Departments have the civil service. The civil service are charged with the task of preparing analysis for the political process, looking at options for the decision, drawing on their own expertise, drawing on expertise outside government, preparing documents to present to cabinet, which outline on the basis of expertise, the decisions and their consequences. Then we have a richer ecosystem surrounding this. We have all sorts of means to bring citizen thought and expertise into the democratic process. The media, interest groups, advocacy organizations, think tanks, university professors, public intellectuals, and many people now who write about democracy have started to argue that legitimacy comes not just from free and fair elections, right to hold office, and universal suffrage, but also by the quality of the deliberation which occurs outside the electoral process. And then if we look at modern democratic thought and we ask the question, well, in this democracy, who really governs? And of course, this is the famous question posed by Robert Dahl. Is it citizens? Or is it interest groups? Or is it elites? And Dahl identified this issue of interest groups and made at the center of his analysis the idea that while we're all equal on votes, we're not all equal in terms of many other resources that are brought to bear on shaping government decisions. In particular, money, knowledge, access to officials, ability to shape the public debate through media, but also public intellectuals. University professors have resources and power in that domain. And Dahl came down to the theory that our democracy is really about interest group sharing of power. Interest groups are powerful on different issues, and that political leadership actually acts to broker this interest group contestation. But our naive portrayal of democracy is incomplete. Then, of course, the counter criticism is that true power is really rests with a small group of elites, and that this small group of elites finally determines who governs, who has power, and how we make decisions, and what values and what value trade-offs are embodied in those decisions. So we go back then to look at this pandemic we had, and I think we can see that there was a huge role for expertise in our fight against COVID-19, first through our public health agencies, an enormous amount of basic clinical and then epidemiological science, then through the science tables. And it was brought to the politicians, went to cabinet, and cabinet decided. Is that the right outcome? A lot of people said, no, we want more science, less politics. My reflections on this is that at the end of the day, we do want politicians, cabinets to make the decisions and make the trade-offs. And that in fact, probably this was an appropriate way to look at it. It's clear we had incredibly complex value questions running through, particularly the trade-off between lives and jobs. But also there were difficult trade-offs around mental health, liberty, schools, the unequal burden. How do we reflect on how Canada did in thinking about that bringing of values in? I would say it was a bit rough and tumble. To me, I was quite struck by the values discussions were not front and center. They seem to be muted. Did I see many leaders talking about moral reasoning, moral perception, and moral character? I didn't really think so. Although you might, well, I'll leave that at that. Then I guess three final reflections. First, as I thought about this and thought, if I'd been talking about this 2 years ago, the question of populism would have surely come to the fore in discussions about democracy, both left-wing populism and right-wing populism, both of which are anti-elite. And tend to be anti-expert. I think if we look at other countries, populism in Canada was relatively muted as we struggled through the fight against COVID-19. I think the anti-elite, anti-expert sensibility was not strong. Did we have a true deliberative democracy in this exercise? I think we did okay. There was an enormous outpouring of media articles, public intellectuals, interest group presentations, and so on. And I think a pretty good public deliberation. Although I think, particularly in Ontario, the government was very secretive about how it finally made the trade-offs. So it didn't, to me, stand up to a basic question of government accountability as part of a deliberative democracy. So finally, just two quick reflections. To me, one of the things which continues to trouble me and puzzle me is when I look at that graph and realize all we'd learned through getting ourselves from January to mid-June, why did we do so poorly in fighting the second wave? Why did we let it get out of control? Why were we so slow to implement severe restrictions? Why did we let deaths 50% higher than the first wave? And interestingly, or shockingly, tragically, the deaths in long-term care were much higher in the second wave, or equally high in the second wave. Out of this, all I can conclude is that at the end of the day, in our democracy, we made the trade-off for less restrictions over control of the disease. We made the trade-off of jobs, but have to admit also mental health, schools, over control of disease and lives. Most countries, the few that did extremely well in the first wave continued to do well, but most countries, the countries that we compare ourselves, did equally badly over the second wave, and many had a second and a third wave. So the dilemma continues as to about why these liberal, democratic, advanced countries with very high incomes and very strong healthcare systems did so poorly in the second and third waves. It seems to me at the end of the day, the answer is politics and the balance of how we've made these decisions and made ethical trade-offs. And then I don't want to get sidetracked on this question, but I can't help but reflect that in the battle against climate change, we face this same fundamental dilemma between expertise. In the case of COVID, the expertise was saying to save lives, impose strict restrictions. In the case of climate change, expertise is saying if you continue to release greenhouse gases, there will be devastating consequences for human well-being. And the case of these discussions are fraught or filled with very difficult ethical questions to struggle with. And in the case of climate change, it's not just present versus future, it's developed world versus developing world, and so on. Do we leave this battle against COVID-19 more or less confident about the ability of advanced liberal democracies to confront climate change? So as usual, I've run far too long, James, but let me end my reflections there and open for questions.
Thank you very much, George, for your presentation. And I'll open the floor for questions. If you have any questions, can you please raise your hand? I see a number of hands raised. I'm going to start with Ian Green, and then I'll go to Benjamin.
Thanks very much, George, for a wonderful presentation. Thoroughly enjoyable. How wonderful it is that we're at least able to have this sort of intellectual interaction during this difficult time. You asked about what approach the YCPE takes to practical ethics. And that reminds me that the center, or the collegium was really started by Don McNiven. You'll remember Don McNiven. Yes. Who led a very courageous fight to persuade his fellow people in the philosophy department that practical ethics is just as important as pure ethics. So I looked at our webpage. We need to update it. We need to honor Don and how the whole thing started. Also, the YCPE generally takes an approach that the basic principle behind democracy is mutual respect, and also that no democracy can operate successfully and avoid excessive corruption unless there's a high degree of mutual respect at all levels. Also, you mentioned the UN Declaration, and of course that was drafted by Canadian John Humphrey. Anyway, I really enjoyed your remarks, and yes, I think the degree to which the right decisions were made, or the best possible decisions about the trade-offs between the economy and lives, really depends on the extent to which people in government and people in general value the principle of mutual respect, how they understand that, how they apply it. Of course, the more populism there is, the less mutual respect. And the more we're likely to make serious errors. So you've given me a lot to think about. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Ian. Just in closing and passing on that, I was struck as I read through both sort of my economics and the School of Public, I went and looked at a number of public policy texts. I was very struck, and I also thought about the York curriculum, that the place of practical ethics, broadly conceived as we've discussed, is not there in the economics curriculum. It's greatly receded in the public policy curriculum, and it's not very present in an undergraduate curriculum.
You're right about that. And if you recall, in the 1990s, when we were creating the General Certificate in Practical Ethics, there was a tremendous amount of opposition in faculty, council, and Senate. And I think the reason is that most people feel uncomfortable talking about ethics. If we have ethics in the curriculum, that must mean we're unethical right now. And so it took a huge amount of work to get that certificate approved at all levels. But in the end, we had some very good discussions about the nature of ethics and why ethics is important. But you're right, it's a constant struggle, and the Collegium is promoting a greater degree of teaching of ethics. The School of Public Policy and Administration has courses at the graduate and undergraduate level in ethics.
Perhaps we can turn to Professor Benjamin Lewinsky. Ben, you're going to have to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
No. Sorry about that. George, thank you very much for an inspiring and highly informative presentation. It was comprehensive, and it also gave some very useful examples. In answering the question of why we didn't do better, what comes to mind, the way I see it, is not only things like the complexity of federalism, which make it difficult then to depend on one source of information or one perspective, but our own lack of accountability. When I say our own, I'm talking about government officials. The edict comes down not to travel, and what do government ministers do? They travel. Our own lack of knowledge and our own inability to be strict with ourselves and therefore be strict with those things that affect people adversely. So I agree with you that I think in the trade-off, we ended up going toward less restrictions, and in a sense that has not served us well. But I think that's also because of the nature of our system, which in some respects is not democratic, and the lack of accountability that we demonstrate toward each other, not only the government, but also people who then follow the example of the government and say, well, why shouldn't I do it as well? So not to end on a cynical note, but I see lots of challenges in our system and in our own behavior, which should encourage us to work harder so that we can finally reach our end goals. But thank you very much, George, for a very clear and informative presentation. I appreciated it. I learned a lot too.
Thank you, Ben. And on the way you were phrasing it, lack of accountability by the ministers who traveled and to our fellow citizens, I was starting after that reading to use the word moral character in my own thinking. That this commitment to live a life ethically. And it seems to me the concept of moral character has almost disappeared from our thinking about citizenship, about leadership, whether it's of government or a business or whatever. And anyway, that notion of individual accountability, I was picking up in my own thinking. I'm starting to think about the idea of moral character and what that means to think about a democracy. It requires moral character. Well, I can't help but close. If we compare Ontario to just about any other jurisdiction other than the island countries and so on, we've done actually very well. If you compare us to Belgium, France, Italy, Spain, Sweden, the UK, Ireland, and Middle Europe has done horribly. You know, the Czech Republic is now the worst country in terms of deaths per million, worse than Belgium, which was the worst for a long, long time. So Ontario is way down. Anyway, but I think we could have done much better. We could have been closer to New Zealand and Australia.
Are there any other questions? Judith.
I can't find the hand raising setting. I'm sorry, George. That was absolutely fascinating. Couple of observations. First, I think all of us found it very difficult to believe in this. That was part of the problem, including everybody's government. The ministers were rushing around and shaking hands and breaking the rules they'd set for the population, and all the populations reacted to that lack of what you called moral character by becoming more flexible in their own behavior. Not much more flexible, but it certainly disappointed us. And every country has its own examples, I think. The thing that is astonishing, if you read up on the history of pandemics, is that every pandemic, and certainly the 1918 pandemic, has a bad time in the spring and a terrible time in the winter. Nobody should have been surprised. This was obvious.
Yeah.
But shock horror, everyone was surprised by it. It's very difficult to balance freedoms in, I'm not sure I'm happy with the word democracy, but whatever it is we live under. Democracies really have to be Athenian and smaller than this, don't they? But the other really sinister thing, I think, is that somewhere at the bottom of this, somebody is having to value lives against lives. And whilst
Yes.
it may not be being done out loud, and the striking thing in the United Kingdom was that normally when there's any sort of a civic situation, it's the older generation that rolls up its sleeves and starts pouring tea and doing doorstep deliveries and whatever. And the thing about this virus was it knocked that group out of play completely. In fact, for 12 weeks last spring, everybody over 70 was told to just stay home. And the young stepped up magnificently. The people have been doing their best, but our leaders have been doing a very complex balancing act, far more complex, I think, than we'll realize, except with the benefit of vast hindsight. And maybe you're right, maybe we just aren't looking at moral character in the way that we used to. I think so that's what I had to say. And thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating.
Just sort of apropos of this, I found it, I don't know what the word is. Let's just say interesting. That is certainly in classical thought. We had the idea of a leader who could be both expert and thoughtful, wise about the common good. That type of person has almost disappeared from our way of thinking about the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I was talking to a friend about university leadership. This was in another context. And I said, we were talking about how the universities have got bogged down in these complex deliberative processes. And this was apropos of how you deal with a budget crisis. And I said, in the quote, old days, you would have just said, well, the president and vice president academic are in charge. They'll sort out the budget problems for us because they have the best interests of the university. And we've deferred to them because they have the best interests. And he said something when I thought was very interesting. He said, I think we need that concept, but we have to totally rethink it for today. This idea that somehow a leadership, we do defer, it's just simply pragmatic and realistic, but we want that leadership somehow to be possessed of moral character. And we seem to have lost that part of it.
Well, this is the discussion the Americans had with themselves in the last election, isn't it? They've elected someone who at least appears to have moral character, as opposed to someone who certainly seemed not to have. But they've had that discussion with themselves. The rest of us probably still need to have it. I do wonder whether your analogy for climate change, which is a slow increasing curve, as opposed to pandemics, which do this, is going to stand up.
I mean, it's clearly not in that dimension, but I was struck by the expertise politics trade-off and the jobs consequences trade-off as the sort of difficulty of fighting climate change.
We have a question from Bob Drummond.
I'm interested in the extent to which we're willing to put most of the responsibility on the leadership. Clearly, there are failings there, but I'm struck by the fact that when we chose, our leaders chose a greater degree of liberty to open up, to reduce restrictions, open up the economy, large numbers of people left the regions that were under lockdown to go to regions that were under less lockdown in order to take advantage of that liberty. And in fact, we're not thinking in moral terms about their neighbors because they were willing to go and infect them or risk infection themselves. So I'm wondering about whether the leaders are much to blame. One thing I would say that they could be easily blamed for is not taking a sufficient moral stance with respect to those people who had no choice about whether they could leave their home and go to work, or had a limited choice. Their choice was either to starve, or at least to be much worse off economically than they would be if they actually went to work. And so I'm wondering whether there needs to be some attention to the trade-offs we made in that regard with respect to distinguishing certain occupations as being essential, but not in effect protecting them adequately in terms of their capacity to avoid the virus. I don't know whether, George, you want to comment on that. I will also say, by the way, I'm somewhat embarrassed as a politics specialist to see such a very good politics lecture given by an economist. But as George says, he was trained in part in politics as well. So. And he had the deanship behind him, which exposes everyone to politics, whether they like it or not.
Well, Bob, I almost don't understand this distinction and separation between politics and economics. They are but one. They are but one. No, I tried to just focus on one of the ethical trade-offs. I think you've identified another acute one, that we asked people to do certain things and did not provide them with protection as they had to go about that business. And I think there were just so many of these difficult ethical trade-offs. In terms of, I still believe very strongly, because of the way democracy works, that leadership matters and matters enormously. And I was sort of struck by one thing and said, well, we voted for Rob Ford. And so I prefaced my case study saying, well, this isn't the same as a normal government decision. We had no opportunity to see a platform, react to it, and so on. True. But Ford was elected, broadly speaking, on a platform of smaller government, business deregulation. Well, I'd say smaller government and suspicion of government, business deregulation, open for business, lower taxes. So, but, comma, he said he spoke for the little guy. So I asked myself, did Ford live up to his platform defined that way? We shouldn't have been surprised. He behaved as a small business, small government, deregulation, open for business, but with some attention to the little guy. I don't think we can deny Mr. Ford's ability to connect with ordinary people across every dimension. But, so that one thing I took away from it was that, to me, one lesson was, in a time of extraordinary crisis, which is going to require significant, bold, and unprecedented government action, and with the attendant moral complexities, small government, pro-business oriented governments are not the people you want in charge.
We've got a couple more hands up. Bruce Preston.
Thank you, George. I found this a fascinating discussion. At one point you mentioned populism, and you indicated that you didn't think populism was quite as much of an issue in Canada as it is other places. And I'm just wondering, given our talk about mutual respect and moral character, and how those seem to be closely related to populism, I'm wondering now whether populism is more of an issue than we may have thought it was in Canada and elsewhere, because the countries that I think of in terms of being very entrenched in populism seem to be the countries that are doing worse, and the countries that are doing better are the countries that are not as populist. And I'm just wondering if we can draw a closer relation with this populism.
I see, as opposed to small government orientation or, well, yeah, because actually I hadn't thought of it that way. And I actually added the populism things just toward the end. I mean, if you have a country like Belgium or France or Italy or Sweden, who have by most measures done very badly, I was coming at them saying they're sort of social democratic countries, etc. Are they being significantly reshaped by populism? I guess, I don't know. I guess all of them are. I mean, the European social democratic countries are being reshaped by populism, I guess, so that I might still continue to say we didn't do badly because populism wasn't so strong. But I think that's a very interesting observation, that the countries that did badly are the ones that had fairly strong, particularly right-wing populist undertones, even within social democratic societies. The other way haven't totally resolved this, but as I've tried to think about who did well, right? And a priori, I don't think we could have predicted, but it seems to me the first characteristic of a country that did well was that it's an island country or had very strong control of its borders. So we've got New Zealand, Australia, Japan, Taiwan, and even countries like Vietnam. And the countries of Scandinavia that did well were the ones that had most control of their borders. So then I began to think, to me, there's almost a kind of, I'm calling it the Schengen paradox. That we look at the formation of the EU and all these, what we often look at as social democratic countries, particularly the more Western half of the EU, forming together to engage in this larger exercise of having free movement of people, free movement of goods and services, ideas, capital. And on the free movement of people, we have generally, at least in a lot of political economy, thought of this as a progressive development. But it has a complexity and a side effect, which is that it's very hard to control pandemics. And so one of the difficulties of control is when you're in a jurisdiction where people can move in and out so much. And that seems to me one of the things that's characterized Europe. Paradox is that in some ways that makes Ontario look even better. Here we are with this huge interaction with the United States, huge movement of goods back and forth through Ontario, and the Americans completely losing control of the pandemic. And yet we emerged with some of the lower deaths per million of jurisdictions, which is, to me, quite surprising.
We're well over our time, but we still have a couple of more questions. So George, with your indulgence.
I'm happy to, where two people are willing to talk, you have a successful seminar.
We have a question in the chat from Beanish Quadus. Would you like to have your question read, or would you like to ask your question in person, Beamish?
I'll read it out. So I wanted to ask, like, considering that Canada is democratic and open to new people and new ideas, so why during pandemic it did not take some immediate smart lockdown options that a developing country like Pakistan did? Like, we're talking about Lebanon, we're talking about Europe, we're talking about all these countries that fall in this area, but we're not talking about those developing countries here. So why are we waiting for examples from the advanced only?
Part of my answer is I just don't have enough familiarity with what was going on in many of those countries. So I have tried to think about it. I have read that in many countries, they have had an experience of infectious disease control that many of the developing countries haven't. And so that they understood infectious disease control much better. A number of people are hypothesizing that Africa had much more experience in infectious disease control shaped strongly by Ebola. I just don't have enough familiarity. And you're right, my characterization has drawn very much on the developed world. And I have is partly because when I set out to ask, how is Canada doing? I posed the question, how are we doing compared to countries that we normally would compare ourselves to? But I think you're highlighting one of the big questions, which is now emerging in the analysis of how countries have fared against COVID-19. And what appears to be the case is that Europe, North and South America were by far the worst hit and therefore worst managed. But in much of the Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia, China, it was far better managed. And this I think is going to be a major research question, both scientific and epidemiological, but I think you're highlighting a question. It's also about politics and expertise and ethics, and why those countries were able to execute more severe lockdowns and have better citizen acceptance than in many other countries.
So if I could continue on my comment on this. You see, the World Health Organization, they have literally given the example of that country. And all this pandemic happened when they were like economically, the corrupt regimes that were there, and they were in their political struggles, and so much was totally not in their favor. And they did not take aid from any developed country. And they only thought about, the poor of the country, the laboring forces, and they did only smart lockdowns. Like people were out, but they were smart lockdowns in areas where it was much needed. So I think just highlighting that is one example we should definitely look at, even if it comes from a developed, underdeveloped country.
Just to follow up. So the example you're talking about is Pakistan?
Yeah.
And so would I be correct in saying that when we think of the system of government in Pakistan, it wouldn't be a liberal democratic government?
It is. It is democratic.
Oh, I thought you were characterizing it as not liberal democratic. My apologies.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you. That adds an important dimension to trying to talk about what is clearly a global pandemic and exposes a big, if you will, gap in thinking about these things. This was really very focused on thinking about things in terms of Western Europe and the United States and Canada, not in terms of the experience of other countries around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was an honor listening to you.
Our last question is from Andrew Presnell.
Thank you. Thank you, George, for your wonderful, your very insightful presentation today. One of the things that you mentioned was the importance of the scientific knowledge, i.e. the importance that our leaders were able to use scientific knowledge and apply that to their decision making. So approximately 1 year ago, this was put into effect in Ontario for the first time with our 14-day lockdown, which then was extended and was extended a few other times. And at the time, it seemed that this was necessary because of another phrase you used, that we were, quote, we were listening to the experts. In other words, we were taking the scientific knowledge, we were giving it to the experts who knew how to use the data, and they were going to advise us, in a sense, on the best way forward. But at some point, it seemed like we stopped listening to the experts. As I recall, last summer, while our cases were dropping significantly in Ontario, we were still hearing from public health experts that we ought to be prepared for the second wave. But as you pointed out, we didn't see much action from government in terms of preparing for this second wave. So why do you think sometimes we listen to experts and sometimes we don't? Because to me, it would seem not quite as effective if we're only listening to them half the time. And thank you for staying a few minutes later today, and thank you very much for your presentation.
Well, that's again, like the others, a very interesting question. How would I think in the first wave, there was a general perception that, things were happening extremely fast and we didn't understand it. And then the horror, we'd sort of seen the TV shots of Wuhan and the building of the hospitals in 3 days and so on, but the horrors of Italy, the stories and the pictures of, overwhelmed ICU units and backed up trucks to take bodies to the morgue and so on, I think really hit home hard. And so that there was a kind of overwhelming sense that we were in crisis. And then the government took the experts' recommendations. Then I think two things happened. One, the economic implications, which nobody knew what was going to happen, became obvious, and that it crashed. I like to try to make sure it crashed one section of the economy. It didn't crash the whole economy. In fact, big sections of the economy did very well, particularly the tech sector and the logistics sector, and the stock market was pricing those sectors. But anyway, it crashed a big sector of the economy, particularly the economy for low-wage workers, required massive government spending to support people. So I think the implications of lockdowns gradually reshaped government thinking. And then I think that the government, and I don't think the experts were very clear for us here either. And I was engaged in quite a bit of discussion with some economists and some epidemiologists about this, that the government started to say that the measure of our crisis is the hospital system overwhelmed? That will tell you we're in deep trouble. We got to really act dramatically. So that was the trigger point. We seemed to start to say, well, we'll take some cases so long as we don't overwhelm the hospitals. And so we were able to go from, in fact, we never actually overwhelmed the hospitals the way we saw in Lombardy and New York. So we never hit that crisis again. When in fact, and here's where the experts were a little unclear, if you look at places like the successful places, everybody had a first wave. The successful places were the ones that stuck with the restrictions. People started to call it a COVID zero strategy. You don't just bring your cases down, you bring your cases to near zero. Then in conjunction with two things, very, very tight borders. I mean, if you look at the border quarantines in places like Japan, China, New Zealand, Australia, they're flabbergasting in terms of what you had to do to get into the country, let alone, if you were a New Zealand citizen, you had to go into government limited plan 2-week quarantine hotel. So they had tight borders and excellent testing, tracing, isolation. So you can manage this pandemic if you drive it to zero or very, very low. So when cases start to pop up, your contact tracing systems can identify them and tamp them down. But you have to have very tight borders there too. And I don't think the experts ever really got that message across, that you had to have, because interestingly, when this all began and Tam first went on TV Theresa Tam, and people said, oh my God, COVID's coming to Canada. Close the borders, quarantine everybody. She said, no, 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 that's not how you do it. That would be racist to do that. What we do is we test, trace, and isolate. So that the standard pandemic response was based on a small number of people and a robust test, trace, response system. I mean, test, trace, isolate. So to go back to your question, why didn't we listen to experts? I think the expert message kind of got muted. That they said have tighter lockdowns, but they didn't go far enough to say, look, if you want to control this, and there was economic modeling that said, you know, if this is going to run for another 10 months, the optimal economic strategy is drive it to zero, test, trace, isolate, tight borders. So you could have your jobs and control the pandemic. So I think the expert message got sort of muted. And of course, the expert message started to come in against some aspects of the restriction. So for example, there were a lot of experts that came in on side of school openings. They started to say, well, yes, there's complex trade-offs, and gee, you know, keeping schools closed is just too damaging to young students and their families. So it became a more mixed message from the experts. So that's how I would try to think through what I think was a very perceptive question. Why did we pay attention the first time and not the second?
Thank you very much, George.
Thanks.
George, thank you very much for your presentation today. And thank you for reminding us the importance of practical ethics and the critical assessment and analysis of public policy. I was really struck by the fact that you were trained in PPE, and I wasn't thinking of philosophy, politics, and economics, but personal protective equipment.
Right.
And I thought, oh, how valuable could that be in terms of this pandemic and the crisis itself?
That's
But
right.
what really struck me about your chart, I seen a very similar chart for that for the Spanish flu. And it seems to me that we really haven't learned the lessons of pandemics and applied those to public policy. And hopefully for the next one, and hopefully there won't be a next one, but if there is, we'll have sufficient PPE in place, both on the physical, practical side, but also on the moral character, philosophy, and political analysis side as well, in terms of the experience of PPE.
Well, I can't help but I have to comment on that, you know, of course, we had a massive study after SARS about how to handle infectious disease. So we had a massive study, including stockpile PPE. And then as I was looking at the Public Health Canada website for various things, I came across a 500-page document about how to manage influenza pandemics. And it was, all the provinces were in on it, everybody, and the most elaborate planning, thinking through document. So will we learn? I predict we'll have massive documents produced after COVID passes on, but given the passage of another 10 years, will it help us? I mean, as you well know, the PPE stockpile was there, but it was out of date. And we hadn't thought about re-procurement. We disbanded, I'm sure you've heard this, the federal government disbanded its unit on global pandemic awareness in 2019. Canada was a leader in working with the WTO and producing an international consortium of people on global pandemic information sharing. And it atrophied and we shut it down in 2019.
Hopefully it will be reestablished or reinstated. But thank you very much, George. And I want to thank everyone else for participating today. Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to remind you, we have another session tomorrow on policing at the brink. So please join us for that. Judith Gleason, who is with us today, is going to be presenting next week, along with Stuart Armstrong on artificial intelligence and its future. And then we'll have the 4th anniversary of the Trump administration, from Trump to Biden, and a few of the panelists are with us today for that session as well. So I'm reminding all of you about those upcoming sessions. Please join us for those. Thank you, everyone, for your participation, and we hope to see you at future McLaughlin College events. And George, I hope your first experience delivering your online remote presentation was a good one, and we hope to see you again in the near future.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation and your listening, and for the questions that are going to send me back to rethinking some of the themes of the way I put this together. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.
Bye.